Thank you so much for including me in this wonderful conference, and thank you to the audience for being here on a Friday afternoon after probably a week of Zooming. So it's a real honor to be here. I am going to spend the next 35 or 40 minutes taking you on a whirlwind tour of American women's organizations over the last century or a little bit more, and particularly focusing on important matters of public policy. I'm going to start at the end of the 20th century with a puzzle. Then I'm going to shift into reverse, take us back to the time of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, then put the car in drive and follow a kind of windy path back to the present. By the end, I hope that I will have persuaded you that we've entered a new and really exciting era of women's collective action, one that actually has a lot in common with the era that the 19th Amendment bequeathed to our foremothers, but one that is uniquely suited to our own priorities and understandings today in 2020. I think you'll find this talk actually follows really nicely from the earlier session, picks up some of the same themes. So the seeds for this study that I'm going to talk about today were really planted in 1999 at the turn of the last century, and in 2000, the dawn of the present one. Specifically, I would date the study to April 20th, 1999, which was a terrible day in American history. That was the day, many of you may recall, that two heavily armed teenagers strode into their suburban Denver high school and killed 12 of their classmates, a teacher, and injured many others before taking their own lives. It was at that time the worst school shooting in history, American history, and it was personal for me. I had spent some time earlier working with a grassroots gun violence prevention group in a vulnerable community in Washington, D.C., where I had been living. And equally important, a few decades before that, I had gone to a high school just down the road from Columbine. So this really hit home. As I was watching the television coverage of the aftermath of this terrible event, I found myself just screaming at the television screen, why is there no gun control movement in America? Now, clearly there were a lot of efforts on the ground and there were groups that were working on the issue, but it just seemed like there was no big movement, that something was missing here. And I thought this was not only a morally important question, but also a really interesting intellectual challenge. So as I started thinking about what a movement might look like, I naturally thought, well, who would be leading it? And here, social historians gave me a clue, and that clue led to American women. You'd be hard-pressed to find a major social reform movement in American history that women's organizations were not either leading or very critical to supporting. So just as I was asking, okay, where are the women in this gun control debate circa 2000, I got word from one of my sources that there was a suburban New Jersey mom, part-time publicist, who was planning to organize 1 million of her closest friends to march on Washington and demand that Congress pass gun reform legislation. I ended up getting in touch with her and studying the development of what would become the Million Mom March on Mother's Day of 2000. But the fact that this woman had to kind of create this organization, this march, out of whole cloth, to me suggested a deeper set of questions about, how women's organizations had evolved over time, how their issue priorities might have changed, how their policy engagement might have changed. So I set out to do a book about, trying to answer some of these questions. So it turns out there is no big national database containing every women's organization that has ever existed in America, together with a list of all the issues they were working on, who their leadership was, what their strategies were, et cetera. So I had to actually figure out how to cobble some sort of historical data together to try to tell this story. And in the process of trying to figure out how to do that, I stumbled across something called the CIS Index. The CIS Index is a series of really big, like phone book-sized tomes, about 30 linear feet of them, as it turns out, that catalog in microscopic type every congressional hearing, what topic it was on, and who the witnesses were, both individually and organizationally. So I sat for many months in the basement of the Georgetown University Library and just pulled these books off the shelves and kind of went through and identified every appearance by a women's organization and entered that into a data set. I can talk about how I define women's organizations in Q&A if people are interested. So at the end of this, I had considerably deteriorated eyesight, but I also had 10,400 congressional appearances, which was every appearance I could identify by a women's group between 1878, the first one, and 2000, when I sort of ended the data collection. There were 10,400 approximately appearances, and those encompass 2,100 unique women's organizations. Now, this is obviously not the be-all and end-all authority on what women's groups were doing over this huge span of time, but what these appearances were a pretty good proxy for what women's groups cared about in terms of national level public policy, and equally important, what kinds of issues Congress considered women to be authorities on. So I had this data set, and I coded a lot of things, and it's very rich. You can tell a lot about different groups, what they're doing, how regional variation over time. I'm going to spend today, in the interest of time, just showing you some pictures of some of the high-level findings and the puzzles that these findings presented. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to know was just how prominent are women's organizations before Congress? And I want to call your attention particularly to the trend to the right of the line labeled suffrage. The earlier stuff, there's a lot of noise. There aren't a lot of hearings, there aren't a lot of appearances. So we'll start at suffrage. And what you can immediately see, this is a graph that shows the number of appearances controlling for the number of hearings that Congress is holding, because it turns out there's variation across time in that. And what you can see here on the screen is in the years before suffrage, you start seeing an increase in appearances, and then it kind of goes up. This is the late 40s, comes down and kind of settles into a steady state through the 1950s, comes down in the early 60s, bounces around, little local uptick with the so-called second wave women's movement of the 70s. And then we hit the 80s and 90s where women's appearances just plummet, women's group appearances. Since this is a conference that's thinking a lot about suffrage and the aftermath, let's focus on this kind of 4-decade period from 1920 through 1960. What were women's groups doing here? Well, it turns out they were doing a lot. They interpreted their policy agendas very, very expansively. So in the 1920s, women's groups were focusing on everything from child health, alcohol abuse, education policy, immigration, consumer safety, gender discrimination, military manpower and military families, antitrust policy, and foreign policy, which turned out to be a big one, actually. In the 40s and 50s, the agenda expanded even further. Foreign policy, foreign aid, foreign trade, defense policy, military affairs, government operations, affordable housing, market regulation, labor policy, education, tax, immigration, agriculture, juvenile justice, elderly issues, water resources, the list goes on. Put simply, in those decades, if you had asked a group, what is a women's issue, you could have gotten any number of dozens of answers. I should note that most of this advocacy was on what we would consider the progressive side of the ledger. So these were groups that were generally advocating for a larger state, more regulation, more involvement in social policy, internationalist foreign policy, and so forth. But there were conservative groups in there too. So right-wing mothers' organizations that were against communism and for isolation and foreign policy. Now, of course, we all know that women are a big, diverse group. They vary a lot by ideology, by race and ethnic identification, socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation, family status, physical capacity, lots of different dimensions. I want to focus here on quickly on one particularly important subset of my data set, which is groups that were representing and led by women of color. And what's interesting here is that these groups, even in the days before civil rights, were showing up at a very steady rate before Congress. Underrepresented, absolutely, but they were there. They were talking to members of Congress about a whole range of issues. And what's interesting to me is that you can see the pattern, the kind of rise after suffrage and through the mid-century sort of looks pretty similar for women of color groups, similar to the larger graph that I just showed. And again, women of color organizations were working on racial subjugation and gender discrimination and the intersection of those two, they were also working on healthcare policy, the military, education, home rule for the District of Columbia, child welfare, affordable housing, minimum wage, social security, human rights, juvenile justice, agriculture, you name it. I should note that in that 4-decade period after suffrage, there were two organizations that really dominated the scene on Capitol Hill. The first was the National Council of Negro Women, which was founded in 1935. That organization alone was responsible for half of the appearances by minority women's groups in the 4 decades after suffrage. And the other big organization that was responsible for 40%, another 40%, was the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and their affiliates. So those were the two really important, prominent groups on Capitol Hill. Okay, another way of looking at these trends is to look at the number of groups that are testifying. And here you see sort of a similar story. So, you know, there's kind of a steady rise in the number of organizations that are showing up in any given decade, and these are unique organizations. So by the 1940s and 1950s, the number of groups, women's groups that are testifying before Congress is more than double the number that were there before suffrage. Here's another way of looking at this similar kind of trend, which is to look at the range of policy issues that women's groups were concerned with and that Congress was, importantly, inviting women's input on. There's a wonderful organization called the Policy Agendas Project, which was put together by some political scientists, and they have a coding scheme that allows you to code hearings according to, I think at that time it was 225 kind of policy subtopics. So all of these appearances are coded according to that scheme. And again, similar story, what you see is by the 1940s and 1950s, the range of policy subtopics that women's groups were weighing in on was more than double what the range that existed before suffrage. So these patterns I thought were pretty interesting, but they also present some historical and theoretical puzzles. So historically, at least to me and as a non-historian, challenge some of the cultural tropes, particularly about white women. So at the time of the suffrage was ratified, some of those early accounts suggested that white women were really not taking much advantage of the vote. That, you know, they weren't voting in large numbers. If they were voting with their husbands' preferences. And most important for my purposes, there was this line that women, the sort of woman movement kind of fell apart after suffrage. They got the victory and then just kind of dispersed. The second kind of cultural trope that I think the data really challenge is this idea that in the 1950s, women were involved in this kind of cult of domesticity, where they were spending all their time being good wives and mothers to their children and you know, baking cakes like Betty Crocker and really not engaged in the world of politics. You know, I think the data suggests actually it's the opposite. The 50s marked almost a high watermark in some respects for women's collective engagement at the national level in public policy matters. So theoretically, there are also some puzzles here. I'm a political scientist. I work with a theory which we call policy feedback, which suggests that, you know, politics influences public policy, but then once public policies are enacted into law, they in turn transform politics, in particular by providing incentives and other sources of meaning for people to get involved, both collectively and individually. So the expectation from feedback theory is that greater inclusion, for example, giving people the vote, would yield greater participation. And you can see that this theory holds for white women from the 1920s through the 1950s, but it doesn't do a very good job explaining those latter decades where women's groups were plummeting in their prominence on Capitol Hill, and but women had, you know, much greater sort of economic, social, and political rights than they had in the earlier part of the 20th century. Likewise, policy feedback theory does a pretty good job explaining the growth in Black women's organizations in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights era, but doesn't do a very good job explaining why after suffrage, which had only minimal effect and localized effects on Black women's inclusion, Black women's groups grew in that period after 1920. So these were some puzzles that I was trying to kind of figure out. And I thought that the first approach to trying to understand what was going on would be to look more closely at the issues that women's groups were advocating on, and more importantly, or equally importantly, the interests that they were representing. So what I did is I took all of those 10,400 appearances, took a closer look at what the groups were testifying on, what kinds of claims on what types of constituencies they were putting forth to Congress, and I coded all of these hearings as to whether at least part or entirely the testimony concerned women's rights, status, and well-being. I'm going to call that feminist issues just as a shorthand. We can quibble with that use of that word, but it's just less of a mouthful. So this is what it looks like, and you can see this kind of U-shaped curve. In the early decades, something around 30–40% of the appearances were about women's rights, status, or well-being. But here in the kind of the mid-century, you see that share really plummets. So what this is saying here with this low number is that most of the time, the vast majority of the time, when women's groups were going up before Congress, they were testifying on issues that were not explicitly making claims about women or women's needs, rights, status, and so forth. This would be, groups going up there and saying, we need to support the United Nations. We need better, care for veterans, things like that. Here you can see with the second wave women's movement, this sharp uptick in claims that were on behalf of what I'm calling feminist issues or concerns, to the point where in the 1990s, something like 70–80% of all of the testimony really revolved around feminism. And I'm a feminist, so I'm happy for that, but it was an interesting trend nonetheless. So then the question becomes, is there some relationship between the up and down pattern that we saw in the volume of testimony, the prominence on Capitol Hill, and what seems to be a kind of reorienting of the agendas towards sort of more of a feminist agenda? So what I did is this is superimposing that earlier chart you saw of the kind of appearances per 100 hearings with the kind of the flip of the chart I just showed you, with the number of or the percentage of appearances that were on that made non-feminist claims, that were on sort of general public interest kind of concerns or concerns about groups other than women. And I've standardized them statistically so they fit on the same the same scale. And what you can see here is that there's a pretty interesting kind of parallel. It's not perfect, but what this is saying is that the larger the percentage of the testimony that is on something other than feminist issues, the more appearances, adjusted for hearings, women's groups are responsible for. And so I thought that was a pretty an interesting finding, but it kind of, again, raised a sort of deeper set of questions about how women were interpreting and how their policy interests, how women were thinking about what a women's issue is, and likewise how Congress was thinking about the role of women's groups in providing insights, policy insights and political insights into a wide range of issues. So I then had to turn to this question of, okay, why did women's agendas change? And I won't go through all of them, but I had to rule out a lot of kind of logical assumptions. So I looked at whether this is because of changes in Congress. Maybe Congress is starting to focus on issues that women's groups are not interested in. Maybe Congress is less interested in having interest groups testify to begin with. So maybe I'd see that same pattern if I were looking at veterans groups or something. I looked at whether it had something to do with partisanship. Maybe one party is more open to women's groups testifying than another. I looked at whether it has to do with the gender composition of Congress. Maybe if we have more women in Congress, women's groups play less of a role. I looked at changes in women, greater labor force participation, changes in gender consciousness, and I looked at changes in women's groups themselves. Maybe they were suffering from funding shortages or changing their strategies, not testifying, but doing more litigation. And basically I was able to rule out all of those things very systematically as being any sort of significant part of the story. So what was going on? I actually landed on public policy itself as a driver of these, or a major driver, I should say, of these trends. So again, going back to the idea of policy feedback, what I argue is that these feedback effects of public policies on the mass political or collective political participation of women through women's groups is contingent on two things. The messages that policy sends about women's civic roles and the incentives that the policy creates for groups to consolidate their gains. So I'm going to tell this part of the story through the lens of two different policies. So the first is the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, the Suffrage Amendment, which I've reproduced here. What was interesting about the 19th Amendment is that it sort of did two things in a very simple sentence. One is it conferred rights, political rights, to largely white women against the state. And it also, though, kind of included women in the state, asked them or tapped a responsibility to participate. So these two things, this kind of duality of the 19th Amendment grafted really nicely onto the traditional frameworks that women's groups had used to sort of organize. So the political rights against the state grafted pretty closely onto this equality framework that women and men have the same natural rights, they should be equal under the law and in politics. The responsibility to the state tapped into kind of popular understandings of civic maternalism and what I call the good citizen rationale. And this is this idea that women have this, have responsibilities toward the family that translates out into communities and even the nation. So this was the 19th Amendment, in other words, was a really flexible platform that that provided for an expansive interpretation of women's citizenship. So if you're an egalitarian group, you can be inspired by this. If you're a maternalist focused group, you can be inspired by it, and so forth. So let me compare the 19th Amendment to the raft of really important so-called second wave feminist policies of the 1960s and 70s. I've given a small example of some salient policies there on the screen. But the important thing to recognize about these policies they were tremendously transformative for women in conferring sort of economic rights that they had been deprived of. So these are, the Civil Rights Act, pregnant protection if you're pregnant, access to credit, access to equal access to education, and so forth. But these were economic rights, not political rights. And these policies incentivized both individual and collective participation to expand and protect and then expand the rights and benefits that these policies conferred. So it was a very different kind of policy. It was focused on women as actors in the sort of private or market sphere. These policies and sort of the second wave movement coincided with another really important trend that I think exacerbated and helps explain some of the up and down pattern that I showed you earlier. Around this time in the 60s and 70s, there was what my colleague Jeff Barry calls an interest group explosion. So there was all sorts of new money and new models for organizing very specialized, single issue, professionally staffed organizations, and they just exploded in this time frame. And as a practical matter, for women's organizations, these new groups sort of pushed some women's groups out of these niches that they had occupied earlier. So the League of Women Voters is a multi-issue group that was really on the forefront of the early environmental movement. But in the 60s and 70s, there were lots of single issue and specialized, professionally staffed environmental groups that were coming online and that would make more logical hearing witnesses for members of Congress. So I argue that the changes in sort of the types of policies incentivize women's groups to orient themselves more toward the protection of, sort of these feminist policies and the benefits, and to think about women's issues more in a more particularistic way. And likewise, policymakers may have ceased to see women's groups as the key voices on things like foreign policy or the environment as more specialized groups were coming online. So I want to come back to where I started in 1999, 2000. My book sort of ended on a down note. Women's organizations seemed to be moving into obsolescence. They were less prominent on Capitol Hill in the late 90s than they had been before suffrage, which seemed crazy to me. But at the same time, we were starting to see the emergence of what a co-author, Michael Heaney, and I call the hybrid style of women's organizing. There were new organizations coming online, the Million Mom March being an example of that were sampling and combining these traditional movement frameworks, the maternalism, the egalitarianism, the good citizen framework in sort of creative ways, often with a wink toward sort of femininity and so forth. And they were creating these new hybrid organizations to take on really big, broad public issues, gun violence. In the case of Code Pink, the opposition to the war in Iraq. Both of those groups became, institutionalized and had impacts in the policy domains in which they were operating. And here's why I'm going to, I hope, pick up the wonderful comments from the earlier session and suggest that in the 2010s, we're seeing an even more impressive revival of women's collective action. So if we think about civic maternalism, which was so prominent in the early 20th century, we can look now to Moms Demand Action. This is a group, I'm a gun scholar as well as a scholar of gender, and this is a group that I've followed really closely from the start. This is a group this is the mass movement for gun control that I was looking for 20 years ago, and it's being led by moms. But they're not just, a group that's sort of lobbying. They're also heavily involved in electoral politics. They just hosted a bunch of town halls with all the Democratic candidates. In 2018, 40 at least Moms Demand Action leaders ran for office, including, as has been mentioned before, Lucy McBath, whose son was murdered and is now a sitting congresswoman in Georgia. The Good Citizen framework that the League of Women Voters kind of championed. This is this idea that, we don't really want to call attention to gender, but, women really are, wink, wink, superior citizens to men. That's come roaring back as the League of Women Voters has come roaring back. The League was the top testifying organization in my data set. They testified 1,000 times over more than 100 policy domains. But the League was, like a lot of these old-fashioned, old-time organizations, had been declining in membership and in clout. In the 2016 to 19 period, they've grown by a third. My own local league, which I used to head and struggled to, kind of revive, as did my predecessors and successors, has tripled in membership, since 2015. It's remarkable. We have committees, we have activities. You can't even keep up with all that our little league is doing. The egalitarian framework got new voice with the Women's March. And somebody mentioned earlier Dana Fisher's work. I mean, what she's finding is that the Women's March, its successors, and some of these allied movements, I mean, the through line for women is reproductive rights. That's the most common motivator across the board. So in short, I think women today are drawing on the full range of identities that we saw, in 1920. Maternalism, egalitarianism, and civic good citizenship, civic mindedness, but they're combining them in really creative ways that that are updated to reflect contemporary norms and sensibilities. So I want to conclude by saying that I think we have the real promise for a newly expansive understanding of what I called in my book women's civic place. Again, every issue now is a women's issue. But as interviews with young feminists that I conducted after publishing the book suggested, this comes with understandings that gender is fluid, that gender is not necessarily a primary identity, that intersectionality is a lived experience of most women, and that women's movements or women's organizations are not necessarily oppositional to men, that they're actually looking to include men as allies. So in short, I think we're starting to see, or maybe in the middle of seeing, a revived woman movement that looks a bit like 1920, but is uniquely 2020. So thank you very much.